Well, hello, AP Euro, and welcome to this bold experiment in online lecture, or at least lecture done at home for you guys to listen to absorb as you will, and come up with some discussion points or questions that you have. I'm going to ask that each of you come in with 3 written questions or observations. That would be things that you don't quite understand, observations that you have, perhaps connections that you might make, or further discussion, or even things that you would like to know more about. That'll be what we'll be doing in class on Wednesday. A couple warnings about this. First of all, the technology may not be super glorious. I've already recorded this once and somehow it didn't save, so I'm now doing it again. Secondly, I've got a 3-year-old that wants Dedo's attention. She's been on a rampage around the house. I am now sitting on the back porch with the doors closed and locked. You're going to hear cars going by, you're going to hear beeping, you're going to hear shouting, and it's really, really warm where I am, so I might swear a little bit, but I'll try not to. I'm also, and I'm not totally sure if I know how to do this, but I'm kind of hoping that I do. What I'm going to be doing is ideally putting this on YouTube and putting the link there, meaning I will periodically say, who knows why. I'll have about a 2 or 3 second pause, and you can press the little pause button at home and think about the question or think about this. See how that works. Might actually be kind of useful. So, the age of Napoleon, and actually in particular what we're looking at here is the Napoleon at home, as I call it. His impact, his rise to power, and his impact upon the French Revolution and upon France itself. Painting by Jacques-Louis David, the painter of the French Revolution. A lot of people historically are very disappointed that David was now using his talents to move from the tennis court oath and the glory of the people to, well, a dictator riding a horse in a way that he probably never rode it as he crossed the Alps. Napoleon himself, his background is worth knowing about. Came from a noble family, and not a poor noble family, but definitely a family that had seen far better days. So not the super elite hanging around Versailles. Actually from Corsica, which is an island. It's in between Italy and France in, I think, the Mediterranean, but I should probably look that up ahead of time. So notice that it's an enlightened noble family. In other words, he was well aware of the works of Voltaire and the Encyclopedia. I'm sure there were copies available to him growing up. He knew about the ideas of Locke and Montesquieu. Highly educated, to be sure. So he definitely, when he was a young man, he actually came to Paris to be ready to fight for the revolution. And certainly there's a lot of evidence that it's something that he believed in, although maybe his personal beliefs in what's right and wrong for human beings maybe was not quite as important as what was right for Napoleon. The one thing that all of you no doubt know about Napoleon is he was incredibly short. We all know this because, in fact, a little guy, a guy who's 5'1", 5'2", and tries to push people around, it's often said, oh, he's got a Napoleon complex. He's compensating for his diminutive status by trying to be a big man. Little side note, I once knew a guy who was 6'4" that had a Napoleon complex, and glad I don't work with him anymore. Well, you know what? Napoleon was not very short. He was 5'6". That was probably about average for his day. In other words, he was of average height. Joseph Stalin, a 20th century dictator, was only 5'3". Napoleon was pretty average. Why is he remembered as incredibly short? Well, Napoleon, in one of his more memorable quotes, gives you an answer. History, he says, is a set of lies that people agree upon. Obvious cynicism there, that the truth is basically people agree upon a truth. And who would agree that Napoleon was far shorter than he was? Any thoughts? Well, his enemies, of course. As there were stories about Catherine the Great's prestigious sexual appetite, and even a horror story about a horse that is absolutely untrue, Napoleon, of course, was just this little man trying to push people around. All of his enemies wanted that propaganda spread. Pretty impressive. At your age, the age of 16, how many of you are ready to become a lieutenant in the French Revolutionary Army and a leader of men? Well, he was. And he was tremendously successful. Whatever one thinks Napoleon's morality, whatever one thinks of Napoleon as a human being, there is no question this is one of the genuinely brilliant men of history. So a great man in terms of his personal powers, in terms of his abilities, for sure. Morally great, ethically great, we can talk about that in class. By the time he was 16, he was a lieutenant. He became a general. He led some expeditions around the world for France, which you'll remember was at war during this period. You'll recall that the Directory takes over in 1795. Maybe just a moment to ask why the Directory, what was the purpose of the Directory, and why did the Directory take over? You'll probably recall that the Reign of Terror, in most people's eyes, had simply taken the revolution too far, far too far. And so a group of, and I believe it's initially 12 men, but I might have the number wrong, were elected by that 50% of the male property holding population, were elected to the directorship. And the Directory simply tried to rule France kind of in the middle. Good Lord, we've got to avoid what happened during the French Revolution and during the Reign of Terror. On the other hand, we don't want to go back to the old days of Louis XVI's Versailles-based monarchy. So really what they tried to do is react against the revolutionary aspect of the French Revolution without going back too far. That's always a tough position to be in. You're in the middle, you're a target from both sides. Well, Napoleon, who at this point was in and out of Paris and certainly had become a leader of men, every time there was a revolt against the Directory, and there were a number over its 4 short years, Napoleon became the go-to guy. The directors would call, Monsieur Napoleon Bonaparte, please help us. Napoleon would raise his army, get them together, and put down the revolt. Famously, in a characteristically cocky, somewhat arrogant fashion, Napoleon recalled his help to the Directory in 1795. That's bad. He was called in to put down a rebellion, and he said later, it was easy. I put down that rebellion with just a whiff of grape shot. Now, what could that mean? Well, a whiff is just a scent. You can barely tell that it's in the room, and grape shot is bullet fire. In other words, did Napoleon have to go in and put down the revolt with extreme force? Are you kidding? I am Napoleon. I can do it by just showing up and firing in the air twice, and the cowards submit to me. He said of himself once famously that he had a chest-of-drawer mind. And Napoleon does appear to have had an intellect that just plain surpassed most people, and a memory that was apparently incredible. He was able to pull out the most minute details of history, of military maneuvers, of government policy, of literature, and able to do it without note cards, without having to pause, without having to say, wait a minute, let me check on this. And he argued that it was like his mind had all of its information in it, and simply when he wanted to discuss military matters, he would metaphorically reach into the chest of drawers in his brain and pull out all the information he needed, and if he needed to quickly switch to something else, it was as simple as accessing the other information. He described himself and thought of himself as a man of destiny. Now, going back to the Renaissance, that idea of virtu, this was a man of virtu. He controlled the destiny of his life and of those around him. You want to see more about Napoleon? Always worth a good soundbite quote. You'll see a URL link there at the bottom. His rise to power, from being a lieutenant at 16 to being a general a few years after that, and in the period of the French Revolutionary Wars with surrounding areas, he crossed the Alps with an army. He won victory after victory against Prussia and Austria in Europe. Quite famously, actually led a major expedition to Egypt in 1798. Egypt was nominally, at this point, under control of the Ottoman Empire. Actually, the British had really started to put their hooks in Egypt, and really, in most cases, in most ways, really controlled it. Well, Napoleon leads an expedition to Egypt that actually fails. He's actually defeated. However, there is something in many people's eyes noble, romantic, heroic about the attempt, and so that's not something that hurts his career at all. You may notice here in the upper right, there is a stone. Anybody know what this is called and what it's for? You see there are inscriptions upon it. It is called the Rosetta Stone. It was found by Napoleon's men in Egypt, and at the very top is writing in hieroglyphics, the language of the Egyptian pharaohs, the pictograph language. This is another language, I believe, called Demotic. I do not know where that comes from. The bottom is ancient Greek. Eventually, people with this stone, which was then brought back to Paris, and I believe now is in the National Museum in London, but I could be wrong about this, this became the means by which hieroglyphics were translated. Certainly ancient Greek was still widely read by the time of Napoleon, and even today, hieroglyphics had not been. It was simply a matter of translating, because these are the same ideas, the same words in these three different languages. So this is why we understand the language of the pharaohs today. The Directory faced coup attempt after coup attempt, and finally in 1799, Director Emmanuel Joseph Sayas, and oh, who is Emmanuel Joseph Sayas? Why, in 1788, he wrote the influential pamphlet, asked the question, what is the Third Estate? And his answer was, of course, the Third Estate is all, and the First and Second Estate are nothing. And he's calling for a dramatic, radical change in society. Well, things have changed by 1799. 10 years of chaos, reign of terror, constant coup attempts against the Directory, 8 years of almost non-stop warfare. And Emmanuel Joseph Sayas himself goes to this still young general, only about 30 years old, and says, Monsieur Napoleon, please stage a coup, overthrow my Directory, take charge. Sayas famously said, what France needs now is confidence from below and power from above. It's called the coup of 18 Brumaire. Why Brumaire? Again, that's one of the French Revolutionary calendar months. So Napoleon, who did not need to be asked twice to take power at any point in his life, drafts a new constitution, and in the constitution names himself the first consul. And in fact, in 1801, he says, I'm first consul is nice, but actually, I'm the first consul for life. By the way, this is the consulate. James Abbott can do crazy evil. A plebiscite is held. Never let it be said that Napoleon didn't believe in democracy. A plebiscite is a vote, but it's not a vote for candidates. It's a vote in which you answer yes or no. And the question was, should Napoleon be named first consul for life? You'll see the results. 3,011,077 Frenchmen say yes, he should, whereas 1,567 say no. Right now, if you could see me, I don't know how to put an image of myself, but I am giving you that skeptical look with the arched eyebrows peering over the glasses with that yeah right look on my face. You know that one? That's the one I'm giving to you. Let me ask you this. If you were to walk into a room of 25 of your classmates and say, guys, do you agree with this statement? Ice cream is delicious. Do you think most people would agree? I do think most people would agree. Are there likely in that group of 25 to be 1, 2, maybe even 3 or 4 people who say, I don't really like ice cream? Well, I think there are. So let me ask you this question. If a statement is seemingly uncontroversial as ice cream is yummy, will maybe get a 92, 88, or 84% majority. What is the likelihood that 99.99999% of all people in a country would say, yes, I want that man to be my country's dictator for life? This is certainly something that's been used over the years. Joseph Stalin and Soviet leaders would win 99.999% of all votes. Saddam Hussein in Iraq famously one year won more votes than there were voters. That was an interesting thing, and it was essentially unanimous. Napoleon was not a Democrat. He didn't believe in free elections by any means, and you'll see some of his reason for that. Napoleon and the Church. Now this is interesting. This is Jacques-Louis David, his painting. He's gone from being the revolutionary painter to, in effect, the court painter of Napoleon. Now, Napoleon has no particular use for religion. I would probably go so far as to call him somewhere between a deist and an atheist, and certainly no purposeful use for the Catholic Church unless the Catholic Church could be used to support his rule. Now, Napoleon's a wise guy. He's a cagey guy. And he looks back and says, one of the problems that the Revolution had, the Convention had, even the Assembly with its civil constitution of the clergy and then the oppression of the church under the Convention, is that most French people didn't like it. In particular, the masses, the peasants, the poorer workers hated these attacks on the church. Now, don't be wrong about this. I think the church is ridiculous. I think it's a scam. I think it's absurd. But if I can keep the power that I need and use my willingness to cooperate with the church, to buy some support from people, to put down any silly, pointless rebellions, let's do it. So in 1801, he signs a concordat. Concord means agreement, so it's an agreement with the Catholic Church. He declares in this agreement in 1801 that Catholicism is, quote, the church of most French. It is not, however, the official state religion. We are not a Catholic nation. And if you were a priest in France, you had to sign a loyalty oath to the French government under Napoleon. And if you chose not to be Catholic, if you chose to be Protestant, if you chose to be an atheist or a deist or whatever Napoleon was, you know what? If you were Jewish, Napoleon had zero issue with your practicing your religion, as long as it didn't in any way conflict with his desire or right to rule. Why would the church support this? Your thoughts here. Well, obviously the church didn't like it, but had to accept it because, as the old saying goes, half a loaf of bread is better than none at all. If you think about it, the church going all the way back to 1516, this is before the Protestant Reformation, the Concordat of Bologna. You'll recall that the Catholic Church had to agree to give the French king power to select the bishops. You recall that there was a huge Huguenot population in France for a while. There was the Edict of Nantes. Although Louis XIV had reversed that, the church, in essence, had little power in France to begin with. And then during the Revolution, the church was all but driven out, and for a while replaced by a cult of reason. So from the church's perspective, we don't like Napoleon. We don't like these limits, but it's a lot better than it's been. There is a precedent for this. Napoleon took a trip down to Rome to get the crown that he would wear with the church's authority as the leader of his country with the support of the church. On Christmas Day in the year 814, Charlemagne had done this, in fact. Napoleon does this, I think, in 1802, but famously, and if you look at David's painting, you'll see this, the Pope does not place the crown on Napoleon's head. Napoleon takes the crown and puts it on his own head. And I'll leave you to ponder the meaning behind that little move. Ah, the great imperial Roman god ruler, there we are, neoclassicism, more Jacques-Louis David. It's really just a bookkeeping change, basically meant the stationery had to be changed. But Napoleon said, I don't just want to be the consul or the first consul or the first consul for life. I am Napoleon, Emperor Napoleon the First. And as of 1804, it's a somewhat artificial division. We have Abbot can do crazy evil. He is now Emperor Napoleon the First. Within France itself, Napoleon, remember, child of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment ideals struck him as right, struck him as reasonable, struck him as modern and effective. And he endorsed many of them and instituted many of them as long as they didn't interfere with his right to rule as he wanted to. Religious tolerance? Absolutely. And again, as long as you didn't use your religious beliefs to challenge Napoleon in any way, as far as I understand, he couldn't care less if you were a Catholic, if you were a Protestant, if you were Jewish, if you were an atheist. My guess is he really wouldn't care if you were a Hindu, Muslim, or Buddhist. It was really no affair of the state. One of the most famous of his statements, careers open to men of talent. What that meant is, I don't care who your daddy is. I don't care if you're of noble birth. I don't care what connections you have. Are you a bright, intelligent man, and it did need to be a man, and are you willing to use your education, your talents, to make my rule, my country stronger? Come on in. It was a meritocracy, at least to a large degree. And by the way, that include the émigrés. Who were the émigrés? They were the staunch royalists, of course, who had left France and were plotting rebellion against the French Revolution. Well, Napoleon, in effect, says, come on back, be part of my system, support me, bring your money back, bring your education, your skills, and your talents back. No hard feelings at all. He also instituted what is known as the Napoleonic Law Code, and this is basically a written-out law code. The government, be it Napoleon himself or other parts of the government, simply would not have the right to decide, you know what, we don't like his behavior, it's against the law. And by the way, this law code is spread with Napoleon's armies across Europe and is in many ways the basis for modern law codes. Noble distinctions, equality is there. It doesn't matter if your father was Sir Fancy Pants or Lady Fluffy Buns or whatever the name was, as long as you were a man of talent. Property rights guaranteed by law. Hey, that is John Locke Enlightenment. And ultimately, I don't believe these are his words. I believe it's actually from one of his officials, but he outlawed, quote, only true crimes, not phony offenses created by superstition, feudalism, and despotism. In other words, if you chose to work on a Sunday, that shouldn't be a crime. If, after all, you refused to take your hat off when Lord Fancy Pants walked by, that was not a crime. That's based in superstition and tradition. You in some way act to weaken Napoleon, attack the government, or in any way don't follow vital orders, and that goes anything from political crimes to arson, robbery, murder, you name it, that's a crime. State-sponsored education, and certainly an indoctrination to be educated in the wonders of Napoleon, and that was very much a part of it, but an educated population is a stronger population. But understand, he's a dictator. The idea of John Locke's idea of government is there only for the people, and the people have the right to overthrow that government. Napoleon would have disagreed. Well, he might have even agreed in principle, as long as the leader isn't Napoleon. The elections, they were over. There was the one plebiscite election which we've discussed. You did have the right to freedom of speech, as long as your speech praised Napoleon and his changes. The moment you began to question his rule, authority, or policies, your freedom of speech stopped. Crushed all opposition, absolutely. You were warned, you were kicked out of power, you were sent to jail, or worse if necessary. He did establish peace with the neighboring countries in 1802, and that peace lasted about 15 minutes. What was Napoleon? He was an enlightened despot. And certainly some wide-ranging changes, absolutely, like you saw from the enlightened despots. Also a far more effective dictator, I think, than any of the ones we've looked at so far. Catherine or Frederick the Great, or certainly Joseph II of Austria. So-called imperial image, and Mr. Abbott, when he comes back in a couple of weeks, will talk more about this, but that is incredibly Roman, incredibly Greco-Roman. This is neoclassicism, and again, the idea of using those fundamental images, but more to support the state, as it were, and support the ruler. These busts of Napoleon on the coins, to be sure, and you'll see here the Arc de Triomphe, that came in Napoleon's time, and obvious, you look at that and you see Rome, 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 Rome. Finally, a few things, the wisdom of Napoleon, and what I'd like you to do here is do some thinking. Do you see some common trends? These are only sound bites of Napoleon, and he is a man of many, many, many words, even more than me, as we're 23 minutes and 9 seconds into this. But these are some of the ones that stand out, and I think they will tell you a lot about Napoleon the person, Napoleon the ruler. First of all, religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. He said in exasperation, the French complain of everything and always. He said, among those who dislike oppression are many who like to oppress. Certainly any idea of women's rights, of any types of feminism, good Lord, during Napoleon's period, no way, no how. Women are nothing but machines for producing children. He said that 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. And you get a certain idea of what he believed about freedom of the press there at this point. We've already mentioned that history is a set of lies that people agree upon. In terms of how to be a ruler, if you wish to be a success in the world, promise everything and deliver nothing. And never ever interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. How do we rule people? Men are more easily governed through their vices than through their virtues. And finally, there is only one step from the sublime to the ridiculous. So that concludes Napoleon at Home. Again, a reminder, you would come up with 3 or 4, whatever you wish, questions that you have, things that you want to know more about, things that you're not quite clear on, observations, anything else. And on Wednesday, we'll spend our full 47 minutes. We actually get a full 47 minutes talking this stuff over. I will hope that as I save this, it will now save as opposed to the screen going blank like last time. See you guys Monday.